Whether it's in time of success, sort of the day-to-day lives that we lead, or in a time of great turmoil, the Christian's ability to thrive in success or distress is directly related to one fundamental thing. What do we think about God? How clearly do we perceive the truth of the Scriptures about the kind of God who saves us, redeems us, created us, and sustains us? When we're succeeding, if we don't have a good sense of the God who creates and keeps and holds accountable, pride is a constant threat. When we're struggling and we lose sight of the same truth about that God, then discouragement, perhaps despair, giving up is always a challenge, always a threat, always around the corner. You and I will not really be able to thrive in life unless we have a very crystal clear understanding of the truth about our God. That's never clearer than in Daniel chapter 5. So go ahead and turn there, Daniel chapter 5. When you get to Daniel chapter 5, we're to one of the most familiar examples of God's work in the Old Testament. It's a very well-known story. It's a narrative that you probably learned in Sunday school or confirmation or some other sort of religious education when you were young. But we need to understand what the point of the handwriting on the wall. That's the story we're going to get today. That's the narrative. That's the incident that takes place. And I want to make sure we understand what it's about. Really, what's the story really about? Because it's the theme of the book of Daniel. In fact, it's the theme of the entire Scriptures, Genesis to Revelation. It's certainly the theme of Daniel chapter 5. So let me lay that out for us, because you and I, very likely in life, will thrive to the degree we get this, and will wrestle with things to the degree we don't understand or live this truth. It's simply this: God rules our world with unquestioned authority and loving kindness. When it comes to understanding something about the God we serve, the top thing we need to recognize is that God rules our world with unquestioned authority. He does as He sees fit. And He does that with loving kindness. It speaks of His promise-keeping ability. He gives and He keeps His promises generation to generation to generation. Daniel chapter 5. Beginning in verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. And right away we have to deal with some things. First of all, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? Last week we left him. He had just been restored to his throne after having spent 7 years in the wilderness acting like he was an animal. Well, this takes place about 50 years following the last chapter. For 25 years now, Nebuchadnezzar's been off the scene. He died, and this King Belshazzar is his grandson. His father, King Nebuchadnezzar's son, and that is Belshazzar's father, had reigned for several years and was now in absentia. He was now gone. He was fighting a battle against another army, against the Persians. That left Belshazzar as the king in the capital city of Babylon. Belshazzar is not a nice man. Not only the Scriptures paint him this way, but other historians have noted that he's a spoiled brat kind of a prince. He's a selfish, immature king who rises to the throne at a very critical time. And verse 2, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, his grandfather, his predecessor, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem to be brought, that the kings, his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. They brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and wood. This would have been on Wednesday night, the 11th of October, 539 BC. The scriptures don't give us that much precise information, but other historians have done that. This is one of the well-attested events of the ancient world. What's so odd about choosing to have a feast on this night is that what Belshazzar knew was that his city was surrounded by armies. In fact, several weeks before this, his father had been defeated by this same army and had fled to the desert and was headed south. Now, the Persian army, led by a great general, Darius, was pounding on the city gates. They were there. Why do you have a banquet in a situation like that? And there's probably at least two reasons. One, as new king, Belshazzar was saying, "You can trust me. I got this." Maybe this was some sort of a coronation for him. He had sort of been reigning along with his father, but this is now he's the guy in the capital city. For sure, there's an element of, I want to build confidence in my 1,000 most trusted advisors by showing them I'm not worried about no stinking army. And we're going to raise the cups and prove to people that our God is greater than the other gods. For sure, that's going on. In fact, what they had done is almost 50 years prior to this, they had sacked Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, had burned the temple to the ground and knocked everything down and had brought all these golden goblets and silver chalices and things that were used in the worship of the Hebrew God Yahweh. And Nebuchadnezzar had hidden them away in his treasury along with the other conquered cities and other conquered artifacts. Belshazzar, for some reason, on this night of all nights, said, you know what? Bring them out. We're going to have a toast in these things. And that's exactly what he does. This party, it's a foolish way somehow to show Belshazzar that he is in charge. And into this party, look at verse 5, where they're drinking, where they're celebrating, where there's all kinds of excess that's going on. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. Now, excavations have actually determined exactly what hall this was. It was a room that was about as wide as this room was, about 60 feet wide, but it was more than twice as long as this. And they've also found, carved in the middle along one of the long sides, a platform area, a narthex like this, where likely Belshazzar would have sat on a raised platform, drinking his wine and letting everyone know, being at the head table, it all depended on him. Into that moment, this celebration of, I'm in charge, I've got it, excuse me, I'm in charge, I'm going to need a glass of water here. Excuse me, I've just been battling a little sickness this week. And I've got it. No, it's not going to happen. Because clearly I'm not in charge. And I don't have it. A hand appeared. So I'm going to talk a little softer here. A hand appeared. And it's interesting because the Hebrew word there is literally, or the Aramaic word is literally a palm. And it's almost like sitting there on this raised platform, this hand faces the king and begins to write on the plaster that is on the whitewashed wall right behind him. And he begins to write some words, 4 words, which were in the common language of the day, but not understood by those guys. So look at what happened. The king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. And the king called loudly. Now, in the first service, I shouted it out. I don't think I can do that in this service. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon. First of all, it's like, hey, get in here. That's what he's looking for. Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Gretchen. Hey, get in here, and I want you to tell me, what is that writing all about? And it's even cold. You guys are great. Thanks. And so that's what's going on. Look at the end of verse 7. Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold round his neck. Shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Promotion and wealth and a new set of clothes. By the way, it's interesting. Third ruler in the kingdom. His father had just fled. He was co-regent, second in the kingdom. He's saying, next to me, you'll be the most important guy in Babylon. That's what's going on, if you can tell me this. Verse 8. All the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His color changed. His lords were perplexed. By this time, there's sort of that buzz going on out in the room like, what's going on? What's wrong with the king? He looks terrified. And they can see probably the writing that's still set there on the wall. Verse 10. The queen, hold on, wait a minute. Scott, didn't you say his wives and the concubines were already in the room drinking? Well, it doesn't say his wife, his queen. In other words, this is the queen mother. This is most likely his mother. In fact, it's most likely the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, who comes in hearing this commotion. She hears something's going on, and she steps into this situation. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Now, what comes next is freighted with a lot of meaning. This queen mother, this mother of the new king and daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king of the Babylonian Empire, is going to deliver some subtle rebukes in this next statement. Verse 11. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. Now, 3 times she's going to say it. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, as if to say, he knew something you didn't. You think you're great calling 1,000 people into the room your grandfather built, and you're not so great. Yeah, wait, I have to drink. You know, I love to preach and I love to just say it with heart, but for some reason today it's going to be delivered with a little less gusto. You'll listen carefully anyway, right? All right. So the mother says, let me tell you some things about this. And she says basically, verse 12, an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Bring this guy in, he'll tell you what this is all about. So we go down to verse 13. Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel. Now listen. What's going to happen next is the king's going to try and just a little bit of poke, just a little bit of humiliation for Daniel. His mother had just said, this guy's the real deal. Listen how Belshazzar starts it out. You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah? You don't belong here, do you? Daniel, you're someone my dad conquered, right? Am I getting that right? And then he goes on, he says, I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. And then he explains, hey, the wise men, the others that came in, they couldn't give an answer to me. You do that, and I'll give you a reward. Look at verse 17. I love this, because verse 17, Daniel, it turns it around and makes 3 accusations against Belshazzar. Verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read and give you the interpretation. Daniel's saying, you cannot buy my loyalty. You cannot win me with prizes, things like that. Verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. It's as though Daniel's saying, you want to talk about your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar? Let me tell you about your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, because I served him for 25 years. Verse 19, because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. Nebuchadnezzar is as though he does what God does. Keep alive, make dead, raise up, put down. But that was a secondary authority because God himself had given him that. Look at the end of verse 20 rather. When his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly. What's it going to feel like just to hear that? You have 1,000 people admiring you, and you're drinking out of golden goblets. You're about to be reminded of a lesson your grandfather learned. He was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. How would that sound in a room knowing your city was surrounded by an army? He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. Remember this from the past 2 Sundays, right? The King Nebuchadnezzar, at the height of his authority, was cut off and spent 7 years as a raving madman roaming the grounds of the palace, living on his hands and knees. Verse 22. And you, his son Belshazzar, oh sure, thanks. Just leave him there, that's good. And you, his son Belshazzar, here's the second indictment. You, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You forgot something that your grandfather taught you. You remember, by the way, Daniel chapter 4, it's the only chapter in the Bible written by an unbeliever. It was written by his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. It was written in the language of the Babylonians so that people could understand. You have forgotten what your grandfather taught you. The end of verse 22, you knew all this. Verse 23 brings the third indictment. You've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his house have been brought in before you. And you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. Then he brings it in for the third accusation. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. You can't buy my loyalty. You've forgotten what your grandfather has said. And you haven't honored the God who gave you the very breath you're taking, or the God who made you the king of this room you're standing in. It's a very serious accusation, and it was one that would have struck the king right at his heart. Now, by the way, this is only the introduction. He hasn't even told him what the drawing means yet. Verse 24. Then from his presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mina, Tekel, and Parson. Old King James says you parson. It just means and parson. And what does it mean? Well, if you translate it as nouns, that is, as a thing, if you say these are 4 things, it would come out as mina, that is a measurement of money, it's a coin. Shekel, and half, meaning half a shekel. So maybe the reason why the others couldn't discern what was written there is because they looked at it and saw coinage. Well, I see a mina, and a shekel, and a half a shekel. But Daniel doesn't translate them as nouns, as objects. Daniel translates them as action words, that is, verbs, things that God is going to do. And when that's the case, here's what it translates to. Mina, tekel, and parson means measured, weighed, divided. Measured, weighed, and divided. And here's the interpretation, verse 26. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mena, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Interestingly, the letters PRS also is how you would say Persia or Persians. This is what's going on. Now, think about it. If you're the king who has just been told your kingdom is over and it's going to be given to that army that's parked right outside of the city walls right now, how do you respond, right? If you're smart, you right there repent and say, God, I'm sorry. Whatever it takes, I'll make it right. But no one ever said that kings were smart. And no one ever said that strong leaders are ever not proud. And so his pride is now on display by what he does next. Look at verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. A lot of good that's going to do. Okay, Belshazzar, although God has gotten right into his face, says, let's keep going on with my plan. I like the way I have things arranged, and that's how we're going to keep it. Look at very sad verse. Look at verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Historians tell us exactly what happened. The Bible there, because it isn't really important to the Bible's point, doesn't explain how this king was killed, but Herodotus and Xenophon and other ancient Greek writers, and actually one of the Babylonian writers tells us that night what had happened. We have a picture of the city. This is Babylon. This is an artist rendering of the ancient city. It's divided, as you can see there, by the Euphrates River. And up at the top, kind of where the river takes a bend to the right, there's that walled area. That's where the king's palace is. That's where we think that very room that he was in that night was. And over the previous few days, the Persian army had begun to divert the Euphrates River and slowly, subtly lowered the level of the water. So that on the night of the 11th of October, 539 BC, without firing an arrow, they crept in under the scuppers, that is, they crept in under the gates that guarded the river, the city from the river, and they went in, Babylonians throwing down their weapons on the way, did not put up a fight. And when they got to the palace room, they found Belshazzar holding a dagger, ready to take his own life. And we don't know exactly how, but somehow they wrestled that dagger away from him, and it was actually the Persians that executed him, along with his chief officials, that very night before the sun came up the next morning. That's exactly what the Scriptures predicted would happen, and it's exactly what happened. Look at verse 30, at the end of verse 31, rather. And Darius the Mede, he was running this army. He was overthrowing the kingdom of Babylon. Darius the Mede, interesting turn of phrase, received the kingdom. And interesting, as though God gift-wrapped it and handed it to him. Received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That is a great, great story. Love how the Bible just so enriches what's going on in this scene. But right now, if I'm sitting out there, I'm thinking, that's very interesting stuff and something like you'd see on the History Channel, but I've got to clock in and go to work tomorrow morning, so what does it mean to me? Because I'm hoping nobody sneaks in and executes my boss. Well, all right, well, let's talk about what are the lessons we take away from this? What are some things we would learn from the story of Daniel and Belshazzar? And by the way, you recognize when I say story, what I mean by that is a narrative that happened. I'm not talking about make-believe, but what we take out of this, three things at least, three lessons learned. Lessons learned. First one is this: God is always working. Don't let pride blind your eyes. God is always working. Don't let pride blind your eyes. In the king's success, God was at work. Nebuchadnezzar had been raised to the kingship. His grandson, Belshazzar, had been placed as a place of king. God was at work. In turmoil and tragedy, God was at work. And think about it. Whether it's his grandmother saying something, whether it's his grandfather who'd written chapter 4, whether it's the queen mother saying, hey, have you forgotten what grandfather said? Whether it's Daniel or whether it's a disembodied hand writing on the wall, God was at work. And this king, Belshazzar, blew past every stop sign on the way. The danger is you and I can easily look past what God is doing in our life. God is at work. Don't be blinded by pride. Don't think, you know what, it's about me and I've done and what's next and I want to. And we can do that and be blind to what God is actually doing in our life. Second lesson. God is always speaking. Don't let distraction close your ears. God is always speaking. Don't let distraction close your ears. There was a party. There was distraction all the time going on. But God was working. God was speaking. God was delivering messages. So a question would be, how do I know when God is speaking? Well, that'd be an important thing to know, right? If God has something He wants to tell me, I want to know about that. How can I determine it? Some ways that God speaks. God speaks primarily through His written word. God speaks primarily through His written word. And we have this story about Belshazzar precisely because God wanted us to have that. Belshazzar's grandfather had written something that became a part of the sacred scriptures. So we ask ourselves, what is God saying to me through His word? Now, likely you and I are not going to find tomorrow's agenda in some chapter in the Bible. We may not even have specific answers for, I've got this decision, I need to know, what should I say? But what we will find in the Scriptures are timeless principles that are clear no matter what our circumstances are. The reason for that is because God is timeless and He has communicated to us of His character clearly in the Scriptures. So when we want to know how does God speak to me, God speaks to me primarily through His Word. Secondly, God speaks through godly counsel. God speaks to me through godly counsel. What have we learned from our parents? If your parents love the Lord, listen to them. If your parents walked with God, listen to their example. God is speaking. He often does that through those He's placed in authority over us, especially those who love the Lord. Parents, what about older saints, older believers? Somebody just took me aside this week. It's a pastor, and he said, Scott, I've got this situation going on in a troubled church. What do you think I should do? In fact, what he specifically asked me is, Scott, if you were the pastor of this church, what would you do? And when I was a younger pastor, I would have said, well, I think you need to get your leaders together. You need to go in there, and you need to really get things going and get them back on track. And what I said was, what I would do is make sure that above everything else, those people know that you love them and that you are heartbroken about conflict in your church. And that the way you're going to demonstrate your deep love for them is to make sure that the heart of God is on display, and we'll tell them the truth about God. And we'll work through this stuff together because we love one another and we love God and we want Him to be honored. Seek advice from older, godly counsel. How about repeated experiences? Godly counsel sometimes comes through just repeated advice. Are you in a situation where sort of the same thing gets told to you by different people? Listen. Listen. Don't blow through all the stop signs like Belshazzar did. God speaks through His Word. He speaks through godly counsel of our parents, older people, or older believers, or repeated advice. Third, God speaks through painful experiences. Daniel had gone through some of the toughest waters any Old Testament Bible person does. Deported as a young man, put on trial time after time, learning a foreign language in a foreign world in a foreign school. And without fail, at the darkest, the most troubling experiences of this man's life, God revealed something about Himself to him. So people that are smart about the ways of God, people that understand something of God's insight, hear His word even in painful experiences. How about this, the sense of distraction? I said that God speaks, Hear Him. Don't let distraction keep you from hearing His word or close your ears to His word. What are some signs that I'm distracted? Signs of distraction, how about this? Always needing to be entertained. Now, I realize we live in a day where there's a lot of great opportunity out there. There's music that can be delivered about 100 different ways. There's TV and music and movies that can be streamed to all kinds of devices. But let me say this. I think it's an immature mind. I think it's someone who hasn't yet developed some depth, who requires constant entertainment. I mean, here he was facing the crisis of his kingship and he threw a party. Why would you do that? It's foolish. When was the last time we turned off the distractions? Just an hour. Let's just do it for an hour. No radio in the car. No television when you first get home. No checking the phones. Spend an hour unplugged. And after about 55 minutes of itching to go check something, what you might find is God may have something to say into our lives. Signs of distraction. I always need to be entertained. I always have to have some noise going. Failing to perceive serious threats. There may be some choices in life you're making that pose serious threat to your faith. This Belshazzar is partying the night of his death. He didn't perceive that the armies surrounding him were fraught with his own execution. It's amazing to me that we can be so distracted, so blindly pursuing, I'll do what I choose, that we don't see the threat to our very faith and life in those choices. Failure to perceive serious threats is a sign I'm distracted. I'm so intent to pursue this way or pursue that way, I don't see the genuine threat nearby. Another sign of distraction, forgetting or rejecting lessons taught by parents. Belshazzar's grandfather wrote an entire chapter that said, I will praise the Most High, and He is able to humble those who walk in pride. That was his grandfather. Totally missed it. Even when his mother warned him about that earlier in this night. Are we forgetting, or worse, rejecting the counsel, the lessons, the examples of our parents, godly parents' examples? That's a sign of distraction. Third application. God is at work. Don't be blinded by our daily life. Secondly, God is speaking. Don't be deaf to that by distraction. Third, God is always trustworthy. Don't let doubt steal your joy. God is always trustworthy. Don't let doubt steal your joy. What I mean by that is that what was tragedy for Belshazzar was God's way of getting glory for himself and working for the good of his own people. God is always working. He's always trustworthy. In fact, let me give you a little bit of a historical thing here, just real quick. I think you'll enjoy this. This took Belshazzar by surprise. It didn't take Daniel by surprise. Daniel trusted, and in fact, I'm convinced one of the reasons why he's so abrupt with the king, almost to the point of disrespect, is because he knew exactly what was going on. 150 years before this night, in Isaiah chapter 45, Isaiah was given a revelation by God that the Babylon would fall and it would be by a king named Cyrus. 50 years. I want you to think about this. Listen as I read it to you. 50 years before this night, Jeremiah prophesied how Babylon would fall. By the way, copies of Jeremiah's letter were sent to Daniel. We know that because Daniel 8, he says he was reading the prophet Jeremiah. 50 years before the events of this night, this is what God revealed to Jeremiah about the fall of Babylon. While they are inflamed, I will prepare them a feast and make them drunk, that they may become merry, then sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake up, declares the Lord. Listen. I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter, like rams and male goats. How Babylon is taken, the praise of the whole earth is seized. How Babylon has become a horror among the nations. For the Lord is laying Babylon waste and stilling her mighty voice. For a destroyer has come upon her, upon Babylon. Her warriors are taken, their bows are broken in pieces. For the Lord is a God of recompense. He will surely repay. That perhaps written while there was still smoke clearing on the temple that the Babylonians had burned down 50 years prior to this. God is keeping His promises. You and I worry about the political world, the educational world, the business world, and all along, God will raise kings and remove kings. He will build nations and tear down nations, all that His promises to His people might be kept. God is trustworthy. In spite of the sense in Daniel's world, he's just been elevated to be the third in the kingdom, and that very night the kingdom will fall. And with calm trust in God, Daniel delivers a message of truth. God is trustworthy. Don't let doubt steal your joy. How about this? 5 years before this night, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, God Himself revealed to Daniel how the nation would fall and who would be the next king. And maybe the greatest thing to come out of this story, 3 years after this night, Cyrus the king who took over, who became the king of Persia that now ruled Babylon, 3 years after this night, Cyrus the king issued the very first decree, and the very first captives that came along with Daniel were able to go back home to Jerusalem, their home, and the city was rebuilt. How God used a dark night and an army around a city to keep His promises to His people. You pray with me. You know, through the hard times, the good times, God is at work for His glory and for the good of His people. It would occur to me if I'm sitting here today, listening to this, I want to be on the side of this God. I don't want to be an enemy. I don't want to have Him at my gate. I want to be for Him. And the way that we can be for Him is to recognize that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that Jesus is the one that God works redemption through. Not through Cyrus anymore, not through Darius the general anymore, but through His Son, Jesus Christ. Maybe this message is a wake-up call, and you're saying, you know what, I never really thought about how active God is in my life and in the world. And I for sure don't know if I'm on His side or not. The way to know that is to simply ask yourself, what do I believe about Jesus Christ? God's greatest promise-keeping was found in His Son, who bore the sin of the world, died on the cross, rose again. When I believe that, I go from an enemy to a friend of God. I go from one who is in the family of God. I go to be one who is in the family of God. So today may be the day that you would trust Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. For those of us who've been believers for a long time, don't give up that sense of God's power, His sovereign control over our lives, even in some of the most difficult circumstances we face. Father, thank You for Your love for us. Thank You so much for the promise that Daniel shows us. You keep Your word. Lord, in success, guard us from pride. In failure, guard us from such despair that we give up. Help us always to trust You as our King, as our God who keeps Your promises to us. Lord, I also pray again for any here who do not know Christ, that they would trust Him as their Lord, as their Savior, and find that You are also a welcoming God who welcomes all into Your kingdom by faith. We ask this in Jesus' strong name. Amen.